Lambda functions and Azure functions are literally exclusively created for the dumbest software developers amongst us. You see, back when Microsoft started delivering APIs, they literally invented the API, the ability to have a software development kit, an SDK, connect to it and deliver an application. It was actually their money making scheme back in the 80s and the 90s, especially as Windows 95 came around, when they delivered Win32 API, which later turned into Windows API. This allowed software developers to use and consume hardware resources without worrying about the internals. So the operating system basically encapsulated the complexity of dealing with shit like saving to disk or using a network card into a well-known, well-documented API, allowing you to perform an HTTP connection without needing to know anything of the internals of the particular network card that happened to be installed on that particular client. Now, as they did, they provided a lock-in. Lock-in, again, is a word originating from the 1950s, from Canon, where they were tired of having cheap copycat producers create lenses for their expensive high-end cameras. So they took a patent on the locking mechanism of the lenses, prohibiting anybody from competing with them to deliver less expensive lenses to the cameras, because they made a lot of money on selling additional lenses to photographers and so on. Later, this became adopted by software development companies such as Microsoft. And now, of course, the last 10-15 years, both AWS and Azure has gone all in on this, and Lambda functions is one of their primary mechanisms to accomplish lock-in. Lock-in means you can never fucking change software vendor. Now, not only are Lambda functions and Azure functions malicious code consistently created to make sure you become a client and that you can never, ever, ever not become a client after you become a client in the first place. But they're dumb. It's just a Kubernetes pod, for crying out loud, that's automatically suspended after 5 minutes of inactivity. And that's why they can, deliver these guys so inexpensively as they can. Now, of course, as you start using shit like Lambda functions, you gotta use DynamoDB, right? Because you're in AWS, you want to take advantage of their more like powerful stuff, right? And as you're starting to use DynamoDB, your inexpensive AI function, where you're paying like 1 cent per week for the actual Lambda function or Azure function, you're paying 20,000 euros a month for the database that particular Lambda function or Azure function is extracting its data from, right? Now, in this video, I want to show you something that is far superior to both Lambda functions and Azure functions. So hold on for a little while. Here I am inside of my cloudlet. I am now going to create an HTTP web API function that takes code as input. And more importantly, I am going to create it such that the code is executed securely. So now first, let me go to HyperID here now. Let me create a new module. Call it, let me delete this foo guy and just create the foo guy. So to create a new module basically implies creating a new folder inside of your modules folder, because everything is by conventions in Magic. Then I can create a new file inside of this folder. I can call it foo.get.hl. That basically means I've now created an HTTP GET endpoint. At this point, I can provide a description if I want to. Then I can provide arguments. And I could also click save and generate, but for the purpose of showing you how to actually create such a function, I want to do it manually in this video. So now we have an HTTP GET endpoint. Actually, it should be post. Let me change it to post. Now it's a post endpoint. And this post endpoint takes a hyper Lambda argument as a JSON payload. What I want to do now, I want to transform this hyper Lambda into a Lambda object. I do that by writing hyper2, and I can do function control space to autocomplete. So now I've transformed my hyper Lambda to a Lambda object. Lambda object is an executable object. What I want to do now, I don't want to just like randomly execute it. I could do this too if I wanted to, but that would result in anybody being capable of sending potentially malicious code to me. And I might also want to do auth.ticket.verify, at which point I can provide a comma separated list of user roles such as admin, comma partner, comma developer. Now, only developers and partners and admin users can actually execute this endpoint. So what I want to do, however, still I don't 100% trust each individual partner, developer and admin. So I still only want to provide a specific set of keywords that these users can execute. The way I do that is by writing whitelist. And that is actually an execution keyword. So when I write whitelist, what the system does then, it executes code. And then I want to declare a vocabulary. Okay, we want to have set value, we want to have get value, we want to have vocabulary, we want to have return yield, return nodes, maybe data.read, data.connect, right? And then inside of my Lambda object here now, I want to add the result of this transformation. So now I basically have an HTTP endpoint that requires users to either belong to admin, partners, or developers. And now I could execute this endpoint. And actually, let me do that from a different incognito window. Dashboard.iniro.io, at which point I can log into a different cloudlet. So now I'm logging into a different server. Let me use the default theme for this one so that you can see the difference here. And now I can go to manage, I can go to Hyper Lambda Playground, I can write http://post: https://app.iniro.io. This is the other server, this guy, you can actually see it up here. And I want to execute this endpoint, which I can find inside of /magic/modules/foo/foo. Now, if I turn on convert through here now, and then I pass in a payload, and the payload needs to be vocabulary, return, nodes, and then I want to add lambda to hyper, and then I want to transmit the result of this as hyper lambda. Now, when I execute this thing, what's actually happening here now, okay, 401, because the endpoint requires authentication. So temporarily, I could now generate a JWT token, and in fact, I can even do it here from generate token, allowing me to instantly have a token that I can save in my config, or I could invoke my, authenticate HTTP endpoint, etc., etc. For simplicity reasons, I'm just going to be actually deleting and removing the authentication. And let's see what happens here now. Return nodes, vocabulary. It succeeded, and we need to, of course, return all nodes originating from the execution. So here what I'm doing now, I'm actually sending code into my HTTP endpoint. That code is executed on the server. The server returns the result of that execution back to the client. So I have an HTTP endpoint that takes code as input. a Lambda HTTP endpoint. I consider it a personal insult that the AWS are referring to their Lambda functions as Lambda functions, because they're not. Now let's do something slightly more interesting. Let's see what this guy returns. 200, so we're still in success land. And now it's returning rows from my artist table in my Chinook database. Now, for the record, I wouldn't do things like this because opening up for a data read invocation might be dangerous. So I would actually instead create a wrapper hyper lambda slot that's probably called like magic.chinook.get artists, and then I would only specifically whitelist that keyword. But this is a YouTube video and I have to cut some corners. But don't copy and paste this code, for God's sake, into your cloudlet. Why? Because it allows users to select any shit from any SQLite database or whatever you've got in your system and return it back to themselves. So it's not secure. But the point being now, let's say I want to do data.delete table artist. I execute this, bam, 500. Why? Because I did not whitelist the data.delete slot name here. You do not find data.delete here. You only find data.connect and data.read. So this allows me to give fine grain, and of course these guys can be like dynamically replaced according to what role the user belongs to, or etc., who the user is. I can look up the user's right from a database, etc., etc. All of this can be dynamically created on the fly. And this runs in circles around AWS Lambda functions or Azure functions. It's just the way it is. So now, not only do I have a solution that is literally 1,000,000 times more flexible than Lambda functions and Azure functions, but they actually are Lambda functions. You see, Lambda functions, the name of AWS's Lambda functions is literally a lie. A Lambda function is a function that takes code as input, executes that code, and returns the result of that code. That is the very definition of a Lambda function. You can read 100,000 software development programming books and they will all say the exact same thing as I just told you now. So facts are, as far as I know, HyperLambda is the only programming language on earth that actually allows for creating and executing Lambda functions. In addition, it's open source. So you can take your code, move it between different vendors any ways you see fit, and you have zero lock-in. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.